The year was 1942, and the world was at war. Newspapers screamed of nations crumbling, of soldiers dying namelessly, of humanity slipping into madness. But in a quiet town outside Boston, a young woman named Clara Whitmore awoke before dawn each day, not to the sound of bombs, but to the gentle hum of her mother's sewing machine and the cry of seagulls outside her window. She was 28, a nurse by training, an artist by heart. Her room smelled of antiseptic and sea salt. Sketches of patients hung beside maps of Europe she'd torn from old magazines. Though far from the front lines, she felt the ache of war with every letter arriving from friends who had gone overseas and never returned. Her father, a World War I veteran, sat silently at the breakfast table, reading about the fall of Paris. Her mother whispered prayers each night, asking God to end the madness. But Clara's mind was already made up. "I can't just stay here," she told her parents one morning, her voice steady but soft. "If I have hands that can heal, then they belong where people are hurting." Her father slammed his coffee cup down, eyes clouded with fear. "You'll be killed, Clara." "You don't know what war does to people." She simply placed a hand on his trembling one. "Maybe," she said, "but if I stay and do nothing, I'll never live with myself." A month later, she joined the American Red Cross, and by autumn, Clara was on a ship bound for England. The journey was perilous. German U-boats haunted the Atlantic, but the young nurse stood on deck at night, watching waves crash under moonlight, whispering silent promises to every star she saw, that she would not waste her chance to make a difference. When she arrived in London, the city was half rubble. Buildings stood like broken teeth against a gray sky. Sirens wailed every few nights, warning of air raids. Clara's first assignment was in a field hospital outside the city, a makeshift shelter beneath a bombed-out church. She treated burns, amputations, and shrapnel wounds until her hands bled beneath her gloves. Still, she found moments of quiet, humming to herself as she cleaned instruments, sketching the faces of soldiers too young to die. "You draw us to remember us?" one soldier asked, weakly smiling. "No," she said softly, "to remind myself that you lived." By early 1943, Clara volunteered to be stationed closer to the front lines, in northern France, where Allied forces were beginning to reclaim small towns from German occupation. Her letters home became shorter, her words more urgent. "Don't worry," she wrote to her mother, "I'm not afraid anymore." Fear wastes time. She rode in convoys through muddy roads, slept beside wounded men in barns, and learned to work with the faint light of candles when power failed. In one of those towns, Rouen, scarred and weary, Clara met Lucas, a young German soldier who had deserted after witnessing atrocities committed by his own unit. He was found hiding in a destroyed farmhouse, wounded and delirious. When others demanded he be turned over to the French resistance, Clara intervened. "He's bleeding like any other man," she said. "He needs healing, not punishment." She treated his leg wound in secret, smuggling food from the rations she barely had for herself. Lucas, barely 19, spoke little English, but through gestures and notes scribbled on scraps of paper, they understood each other. "You are not my enemy," he wrote once, his handwriting shaking. She smiled faintly. "Nor you mine." Weeks passed. Rumors spread that someone was hiding a deserter. Clara knew discovery meant death for both of them. One night, when the Allies launched another offensive and chaos consumed the camp, soldiers burst into the cellar where Lucas was hiding. Clara stepped in front of him, arms outstretched. "He's unarmed," she cried. "He hasn't fought for months." "Please, don't make this war uglier than it already is." The commander ordered her arrested. Lucas was dragged away. At her tribunal days later, Clara faced 3 officers in a cold stone room. They accused her of treason, of aiding an enemy, Her uniform was torn, her hair streaked with ash, but her eyes, steady and unbroken, met theirs without flinching. "You call him the enemy," she said quietly, "but I saw a boy who'd lost his humanity and wanted it back. If that's a crime, then you may hang me, but you'll never stop me from believing that mercy is stronger than hate." The officers stared unmoved. Yet one, a British colonel weary of the endless bloodshed, leaned forward and whispered, "Go home, nurse. Before the world swallows you whole." They released her under secrecy, but she knew she could not return. Clara joined a resistance network, using her nursing skills to aid both soldiers and civilians. She cycled through the countryside at night, carrying bandages and penicillin hidden in bread baskets. She became a ghost of the war. Locals whispered of a woman in a Red Cross coat who appeared after bombings, healing the wounded and vanishing before dawn. Once, during an air raid, she dragged two children from a burning building, her hair catching fire briefly before she smothered it with her bare hands. Her scars stayed with her for life. When the war finally ended in 1945, Clara stood among the rubble of Paris, exhausted but alive. Lucas had disappeared into the chaos. She never learned his fate. She returned to the United States with nothing but a small leather satchel of sketches and journals, filled with the names and faces of hundreds she had helped save. No one met her at the dock. No parades, no medals. Only silence and the faint gull cries that reminded her of home. For a while, she tried to rebuild her life in Boston. She took a job at a hospital, but the sterile corridors felt too quiet. The laughter of young nurses rang hollow in her ears. Nights were the hardest. She'd wake to the sound of phantom sirens, heart racing, the smell of smoke in her dreams. But when a new tragedy struck, an epidemic outbreak in New York's poorer neighborhoods in 1952, she packed her satchel again. "Maybe healing the living will quiet the ghosts," she murmured. In New York, Clara found chaos again. Streets overflowing with the sick, children crying for medicine that hospitals had run out of. Without waiting for official approval, she converted an abandoned warehouse into a makeshift community clinic. She recruited volunteers, trained teenagers to clean wounds, and slept only a few hours each night. The mayor's office eventually noticed and sent supplies. "Who authorized this operation?" a city officer asked her. She smiled faintly. "No one," she replied. "The people did." For nearly 3 decades, Clara worked in that neighborhood, treating immigrants, the homeless, war veterans, anyone who walked through the doors. She never married, saying her heart had already given its vows to those who needed her most. When storms hit the city, she walked miles through flooded streets to deliver medicine. When power failed during blizzards, she lit lanterns and kept working. She aged quietly. Her once blonde hair turned silver, her hands grew thin and wrinkled, but her eyes, those fierce, unyielding eyes, never lost their light. By 1983, Clara was 70 years old. The clinic walls were covered with old photographs, drawings, and thank you letters written by children who had grown into adults. One cold December morning, she found a small envelope on her desk. Inside was a photograph of a middle-aged man standing beside a memorial in France. Lucas, the young German deserter she had once saved. On the back, written in German, were the words, "I found peace because you believed I could change." "The world owes you more than it knows." Clara sat for a long time, tears blurring her vision. She folded the letter carefully and placed it between the pages of her journal. That winter was harsh. A flu outbreak swept through the city, and despite her age, Clara refused to rest. "They need me," she told her assistant, coughing but smiling. "A little fever won't stop an old nurse." But the fever grew worse. One night, as snow fell quietly outside, she collapsed beside a patient's bed. The city that once ignored her came alive. Dozens of people, those she had treated over decades, gathered outside the clinic, holding candles, whispering prayers. Inside, Clara stirred weakly, opening her eyes to the flicker of light through the window. Her assistant held her hand. "They're all here for you," she whispered. Clara smiled faintly. "No," she murmured. "They're here for each other. That means I did something right." Her last words, barely audible, were, "Be kind, even when the world isn't." She passed quietly that night. The newspapers the next morning carried the headline, "The Quiet Angel of New York Dies at 70." The city held a vigil in her memory. Former soldiers, nurses, immigrants, and orphans came together, people of every language and color, all connected by one woman's unshakable compassion. Years later, historians discovered her journals, which had been donated to a museum. Inside were pages of names, not soldiers or heroes, but children, villagers, and strangers she had met. Some pages had sketches of faces, others were filled with simple notes like, "She laughed before the morphine took her pain," or "He asked if anyone would remember his name." Her writings became part of a documentary shown in schools across the US and Europe. Nurses wept watching it. Students wrote essays about her life. And somewhere in France, the children of Lucas visited her memorial, laying wildflowers beside her portrait. Clara Whitmore had no statues, no medals, no descendants. But she left behind something far greater, proof that even in the darkest century, compassion could be a weapon more powerful than war.